grieving. Some families will be lost to one another forever. To those of you who face the difficulties of reconnecting with family and establishing ongoing relationships, we say sorry. We offer this apology in the hope that it will assist your healing and in order to shine a light on a dark period of our nation's history. To those who have fought for the truth to be heard, we hear you now.
You're listening to Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption. I'm one of your hosts, Jo Sparrow. This podcast is a production of Jigsaw Queensland Post-Adoption Support Service. However, the views expressed are those of the people participating, not necessarily Jigsaw Queensland. The podcast discusses adult themes and listener discretion is advised. Last episode, we heard a personal story that covered themes relating to advocacy and how far we've come in Queensland. Today, we are following up again with Jigsaw Queensland's president, Dr. Trevor Jordan, about the emotions that can arise when doing advocacy work, how far we've come in Queensland and Australia, and what is possible in the future. Trevor is a long-term advocate of responsible adoption reform and education. For 20 years, he taught public and professional ethics at the Queensland University of Technology. As a person adopted in the closed adoption era, he developed a particular interest in ethics and adoption. Trevor, welcome again to Adopt Perspective. Tell me, are we all capable of making a difference?
Oh, well, Jo, it's good to be here. And look, in my experience, we are all capable of making a difference. And whether that difference will be helpful or harmful depends on whether we give some attention to not just what we're after the ends, but also the means, how we go about it. And, often when we want something to change, we adopt a position and we focus on personalities. But in my experience, if we focus on some principles, we can be more flexible in social change and advocacy, and we can learn. So that's the first thing. And the other thing about being able to make a difference is we can, while we're trying to make a difference, and some of these things take a long time, we need to learn to live well now, as well as we can now, and not to be placing all our investing all our emotions in getting an outcome. And we need to learn as well to live as well as we can while we're on that road. In the past, I've heard some people say, you find the near edge of a problem and you act on it. You don't have to go to the centre of it. You find out how something's affecting you and try to act on that rather than taking everything into account as an individual. And you'll find that if you start working with other people, then some of that you'll get more areas that you can cover in terms of social change. Yeah.
Sure. Trevor, there are many people, adopted people around the world that are fighting for their rights still, who might look to Australia and particularly Queensland with envy. What are some of the gains that we've made here since the early 90s?
Well, that's right. I mean, I've had the privilege of, through work interacting with people, for example, in the United States, France, Italy, the UK, and other parts of the world, and certainly in terms of adoptee activism, trying to get access to original birth certificates, etc. And they're just amazed at what we've been able to achieve in Australia. Okay, for example, we have a right to access our identifying information in Queensland. That will be given to us. We can access a copy of our original birth certificate, and original parents and their sons and daughters can state a preference for whether they want contact or not and how they want it. But the key thing too is one of the changes that's come in is there's no penalties if that's breached. So we're not criminalising mothers and fathers and sons and daughters through these changes in the laws. The names of putative fathers on adoption files are given to adoptees in Queensland. If the relevant parties are deceased, then it's intergenerational. Their children and grandchildren can access information about the identity of the other parties, the people they're related to. Those changes in the law, in the sense of getting what people wanted, is one side of the story. But of course, that comes with some anxiety because we're changing fundamentally the way in which people relate in adoption, and that creates anxiety. So change creates anxiety. So one of the most important changes I think that's good in Australia is that both state governments and federal governments now fund post-adoption support services to help people negotiate these changes. It's not just the law has suddenly changed and people are left to floundering. They're given services to help them negotiate the impact on the relationships that come with changes in law, and I think that's been particularly good. And if people want help, it's there. It's not compulsory. It's not mandated. And of course, the other fundamental achievement in Australia that Australians have acknowledged through their federal and state governments that pass policies and practices with regard to adoption, particularly forced adoption, but we're not up to the standards that we would accept today, and in some cases we're often done illegally and unethically. And so each Australian state has made a formal apology for those practices and does fund professional education and direct support services to those affected. So it's a great achievement, and it hasn't happened overnight, of course.
Yeah, when you list them off like this, it does feel like it just all changed overnight. But the reality is that these changes have been the work of many people and many years. And I know that you played your part in making them happen also. What motivated you to advocate for these changes?
Well, yes, all these changes are the work of many hands, and I did draw some satisfaction that I played only a small part in this, because this has been, well, Jigsaw's been around, for example, for 43 plus years, and there's many other people who've started this journey a long time ago. I'm personally involved because I was the product of the closed system of adoption, where official records were sealed forever, and my adoptive mother took full advantage of that by not revealing my adoptive status, and my adoptive father thought differently. And when my mother died, he gladly disclosed the secret and provided some information. And I've lived through successive adoption information regimes where he gave me some information I wasn't entitled to any from the government, and then they had provided non-identifying information about my mother and any other siblings I had. To then later the laws changes and they provided identifying information. So I've had a deep personal interest in changes of policy because these things affected me, and part of the adoption trauma is that when you go and ask for things, that there's knowledge there that the government of the day has, and they say you're not entitled to it. It kind of makes you feel pretty bad. So I thought, I don't want this for other people. I was lucky. I was able to combine my professional interests, which, as an academic teacher and researcher in applied ethics in public and professional life, I was able to combine that concern with public ethics and policy with researching that in the area of adoption, plus being able then to make personal connections with activists overseas. And I must say, I got a lot of insight from American Adoption Congress people, adoption reform people in the US, and the activist group called Bastard Nation in adoptee activists in the USA, who have very strong social change agenda and are particularly using the internet to coordinate action and responses. So things came together for me, but during that process, I was still not having access to information, and so that kept me going. And then when you do get information, you realise that's not the be all and end all. You do need support, and you do need to put all this in a context and be able to negotiate the relationships. So that's why it's good to have the services around.
I imagine that over the years you've learned a thing or two about the processes involved in advocacy. Something that I find personally doesn't help move things forward in any kind of negotiation or meeting setting is when people just keep pointing out the problems. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's right. I mean, I found that the most receptiveness to my point of views and Jigsaw's point of view is when we've been able to offer solutions and not just problems. Everyone has a gripe, and there's people who want what we want, and there's people who want the complete opposite. And just focusing, so what is a solution for us can be a problem for other people, and their solutions can be our problems. So we have to learn to let policy makers know as clearly as possible what we would like to see happen and why. If we just focus on the problem, it's just saying, I've got a problem, you deal with it. And there's enough people affected by adoption to sit down and talk about, well, what would make things better here? What would move things forward? Rather than relying on people who aren't affected by adoption to tell us what would be good for us. I mean, that's been part of the problem in the past with adoption policies. People not really affected, assuming what would be the best for people affected by adoption. So the key is to let policymakers know what you'd like and what you'd like to see happen, and provide them with simple talking points, preferably backed up with information and evidence if you've got the resources. And if you can sell an idea to a policymaker, or your local representative, or a government minister, or an opposition person, then they can sell it to others. But they find it hard to convince others if you haven't provided them with a clear view of what you want. And sometimes, you need a blurred view of what you want, because there might be even better solutions out there than you've thought of as well. So it's good to keep humble as well.
I imagine that good listening skills would come in handy when advocating.
Oh, absolutely, because I think, a lot of activists go in knowing what they want. This is the dark side, if of being clear about what you want, but they don't listen to see the problem as the policymaker sees it. Because you've got to remember that the policymaker is probably interacting with a wider group of people affected by adoption, and they're trying to balance those interests. You don't want them just to take sides. You want them to make the decision that's a sound, fair, and just response. And so you need to listen carefully to the problem as they see it. And if you think their viewpoint is wrong, then you have to counter it or neutralise it if you can. But it's very important part of listening to show respect for the person when you're doing so. Being respectful towards others is particularly helpful in influencing the public and the policymakers who are undecided, because that shows you're kind of interested in dealing with their questions and not just going in there and trying to steamroll them with your sense of what you think is right.
Trevor, I'm often triggered by media and lobbyists calling for increases in the numbers of adoption in Australia, and I do not work or think well when I'm in that frame of mind. How do you balance your emotions and stick to the facts during these discussions?
Well, that's an interesting thing, because I'm in the same boat in some sense. If it's easy to be triggered by these things, and but it's important to let policy know that there is an emotional impact of their policy in practice, but not to overdo it. I mean, some people's view of activism is that you go in as passionate and showing as much harm has been done to you as possible. It's almost like going in with a wound and trying to get a sympathy response for them. But your opponents can get teary too and be passionate. So that passion is important, but it only takes you so far. And it's important to try and rethink the impact of what's happening to you in terms of the principles that would help things change for you. What needs to change for your situation to be better, rather than to adopt a position? Because when you can negotiate on the basis of agreed principles and shared values, but with positions you can only take sides. So you need to, and that's the problem with relying too heavily on the emotional response. And I think it's very important as an activist not to make this all your life, to seek other sources of wellness and living well, to stay centered on who you are and what you want things to change, and not to be totally reliant on those change happening perhaps within your lifetime, but celebrate them when they do. So you have to find resources for you to stay on keel, not to be buffeted by it's good when people agree with you and you get what you need and what you want, but it's not to be buffeted too much when things don't happen. That can be just going from pillar to post. So it's good to develop some personal sense of, if you like, spirituality or centeredness that keeps you on keel no matter what's happening to you.
Yeah. And I mean, for us, the people who are affected by adoption, it's a major and priority issue, but that isn't the case for everyone out there, is it?
No, well, adoption affects a lot of people. When you add up the parents affected, and then the grandparents and the siblings and all that, it's hundreds of thousands of Australians are affected. But Australians are affected by other issues as well, and really it is a minority issue of sheer numbers, if you like, votes. I'm adopted or whatever, and I vote. It's not going to get you very far and carry the day with policy, mate. You can't force a policymaker's hands. And as I said sometimes before, we're not the Sopranos. We can't get people to do what they don't want to do. And
I feel like a soprano sometimes, Trevor.
Yeah. Well, some people think, you can twist people's arms, but, it's very important because it is a minority issue.
Trevor, when you enter a room to discuss adoption issues, I can't say discuss today, when you enter a room to discuss adoption issues, what have you packed into your strategy bag?
Well, I think first thing is you've got to breathe deeply. I think it's very important to try to be the reasonable person in the room. I've found if I've had the opportunities to be in the room, and this doesn't always happen, in forums where there's people from different sides of the fence, as it were, in the discussions, then by being the reasonable person, then your viewpoint will stand out a little bit more. So you listen with respect to everybody, show respect, and don't show disrespect for your opponents if they're in the room with you. Let them make that mistake, because if they show disrespect and policymakers see this, they might think, well, why should I agree with these people when they're being rude to these other people, in my presence? It's a bad strategy. So be the reasonable person in the room, show respect for everyone there, and then offer constructive ideas. You want things to move forward, and you want to try and able to offer ideas. And if others offer ideas, affirm their contribution. Have a think about it. Well, I didn't think about that, but maybe how can we do something there? Try to find, that's important, to be constructive. I've found it helpful to try and identify 3 core principles to keep you moving in the right direction, and also so that you can assess any new information coming to you. So, for example, personally, I developed the three guiding principles that I work on is openness and honesty at all levels. So does the policies encourage openness and honesty? Is information being given and shared? Then there's the lifelong best interests of the child. So not just as when they're a child, but when they're an adult. Does this policy look after the lifelong interests of the person it's meant to be about? And then the third principle for me is, because I don't want the law to define every area of our life, is there adequate support services both before decisions are made and after decision made? So whether it's fostering or adoption, are there adequate services? Because without that, social change is high anxiety, and without providing support services, then you're just transferring the anxieties from one group of people to another. So I usually try to use those broad principles to assess whether the information that being given by a policymaker or someone else's idea, how it fits in with that. And, not to have like a list of 20 or 30 things. Life is complex and things will have to be worked out, but to try to have some guiding principles that one can flexibly assess the information that's being presented to you, at the time. Now, because of my professional background, I have a deeper list of things that anything to do with public policy and ethics that, is it caring? Is it honest? Is it accountable? Is it something a good citizen would do? Is it fair? I mean, that's a deeper kind of thing that I'm used to doing because that's the kind of expertise that I had in my career to be able to run, if you like, make values-based decisions. And, I think we all could benefit by looking at what are the core values that underpin our interactions with others and our policy objectives. The other thing is, when I enter the room, I'm trying to find out who in the room here actually has their fingers on the keyboard. Who's actually doing the work here? Because the minister or the honcho is not necessarily the one. They're the one who's getting information from others, or their information that they're hearing is being processed by advisors. But who's actually got their fingers on the keyboard, developing a discussion paper or doing the research, and find that person and make sure that they're getting the information you want them to have, or that they know that there's a communication line to you or your organisation if they need information about numbers or impacts or what might happen if they were thinking of doing something. Now, obviously, when you have a discussion paper and they ask for submissions in these committees, then you get that opportunity. But even before that, you should try and find out, if possible, who's actually working on this, and provide them preferably sort of evidence and reasoning to support your case. But you've got to be wary of over personalising issues when you enter a room to discuss the issues. It's to be, if you like, be professional. It's not all about the persons, because the persons can change. I know with adoption legislation change in Queensland from 2000 to when the law was changed in 2010, we dealt with 5 different ministers during that period. So if you over-personalised your relationship with any particular minister, they may not be there. They might move on to another portfolio. So, and that's done over-personalised in a positive sense, like they're good and friendly and receptive, and these people aren't. Just try to think in terms of, okay, these people can change, but it's the government of the day I want to provide information for. The other thing, when I enter a room, I'm always aware of my own. You mentioned triggers, but because of the past trauma of adoption, when stakeholders meet together with policymakers, it's good to try and if we're in the same room, to try and set some ground rules. We've done that in Queensland, and when we the various stakeholders meet with the government, there are ground rules for how we run the meetings so people aren't triggering each other, and it helps to lessen bullying behaviour and manipulation, and these things can be addressed because there's some ground rules for interaction. So that helps make life in the room where you're discussing the issues a little bit more pleasant and less triggering.
Trevor, can you give me a bit of a brief overview about the Queensland Government's most recent call for submissions and what Jigsaw Queensland sent through to the department?
Well, Jigsaw did make a submission. There was some amendments being made to some adoption legislation and child protection legislation. Those amendments happened, but those amendments were a response to the Deputy Coroner's remarks around the death of Mason Jet Lee, who was in care at the time, about adoption as a genuine, unquote, adoption option in Queensland. And those amendments were to clarify the current situation, because Queensland has 2 laws with regard to adoption and child protection, and some of the other states have it under one act. It was really, the amendments were to clarify the permanency options in Queensland, and where adoption was part of those options, but in Queensland, current Queensland policy is to see adoption as the second last option, other than under fostering under the direct control of the Director General. So Queensland favours permanent guardianship and permanency for kids who are floating around in the foster care system. So the amendments were basically to clarify that. People were upset by these clarifications because they thought, I think some people thought these were new things, or this was a statement of this is the bigger opportunity to review the Adoption Act, when it really wasn't. The Adoption Act comes up Queensland legislation comes up review regularly every 5 years. So next year is when the whole Adoption Act is being reviewed. So I think people got upset because the clarifications, they didn't understand the context of the clarification. So Jigsaw supported those clarifications, which were really just stating what the current law is in Queensland. But we took the opportunity in our submissions to say that there's unfinished business at the both state and federal levels after the apology, and that adoption has to be significantly different from past practice. So we put that in our submissions, and both written and to the committee in person. But here's an important lesson for activists: you need to present your activism in a timely fashion. Next year, when the adoption legislation review, is the time for people to really make the suggestions about how the Adoption Act should be reformed, because you keep your powder dry until it's time. You don't keep building little fires all the time. A lot of activists just keep building little fires all the time instead of gathering the wood and then at the appropriate moment, getting a nice bonfire going. But next year is a time for us to really, as a community of people interested in adoption reform, to address those issues. So we did a submission that time just to indicate, yes, that's good, that people know that permanent guardianship is preferable to adoption in Queensland policy. But to see that next year is the time to make even further changes.
Trevor, the bill's been put on the back burner while the government is in caretaker mode, awaiting
there you go.
in November.
No matter what hard work you put in, you can't.
Yeah, we touched on
you can't control these things, can you? No,
you can't.
Neither can they.
So we could potentially be dealing with an entirely new political party next year. Is this something obviously it is something you consider in your advocacy work? How do you consider it, I guess?
Well, yes, I think that's why it's very important not to focus on one politician or political party. I mean, back in 2000, when adoption legislation review was announced back then, certain people within a government of the day can have a view of adoption that's different, perhaps, than even the majority of their party. And, a lot of social change activists work on the idea of champions. You need a champion in the government, or you need a champion in Parliament. But sometimes the people with a different view to you have the champion and you don't. So that's why it's important not to put all your big eggs in one basket, as it were, of expectations, to develop positive relationships with decision makers across the board. And sometimes positive policy outcomes be delivered by politicians that you otherwise don't agree with. And also, not only that, but your political hero can drag the chain on adoption reform because it's not high on their agenda. So that's why it's so important to try and get bilateral support and bipartisan support, and to get, use the diversity within the adoption community to get the ear of politicians around to get that support. We've got to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, because, this is the reality of, is that whoever's in political power at the time is looking for good news stories, and any politician that's out of power is wanting bad news stories.
That's
and
exactly right.
You have to be careful how you use that you don't inadvertently feed a beast here. But anyone will take a bad luck story, but whether it creates enough energy for reform in our area is sometimes dubious. But you need to keep up those personal stories to the community. We've come so far from that kind of situation now, and it's been a long haul, but it has been the work of many hands, and no one person can claim any credit for this. And and in fact, it's very important that as many people as possible, that the government of the day gets the message from as many different diverse groups of stakeholders and people affected as possible.
These are great tips, Trevor. And I think that during this time of coronavirus, when our emotions are often running high, they are particularly relevant. So thank you so much for your time today and for all of your support, wisdom, and ethical advice during the production of the podcast. It has been quite a year, and as always, you've steered Jigsaw Queensland through it safely and with innovation.
Well, thanks, Joe. It's
You're
good to be
welcome, Trevor.
appreciated. It's good to be appreciated now and then.
So we'll say goodbye to Trevor now, and I'll just ask, do you have a story that you'd like to share with us? If so, we'd love to hear from you. Go to our podcast page on www.jigsawqueensland.com and you'll find a prospective guest form to fill in and submit to us. And remember that the podcast is listened to all over the world. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on and drop us a review, and please share us with your contacts so that more people can access information and support.
Thanks for listening to the Adopt Perspective podcast. If you'd like to find out more, go to the podcast page on www.jigsawqueensland.com and you'll find a wealth of information and resources on the website. If you reside in Queensland, you can reach Jigsaw Queensland's Forced Adoption Support Service on toll-free 1800 210313, or you can call Jigsaw on 07 33 58 6666. If you live in another state of Australia, you can still call the Forced Adoption Support Service number, and your call will be answered by the Forced Adoption Support Service in the state that you're calling from. In every other state, Relationships Australia operates this service. A big thank you to Matt Sparrow for composing and recording our original theme music. Until next time, I'm Jo Sparrow saying farewell from Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption.